Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all the storylines as we head into this upcoming weekend. A new coach will be a champion for the very first time. It'll be really interesting to see how that coach is received. Obviously, Ryan Day might just need it the most, and we might talk about that a little bit later in the week. Probably tomorrow we'll get into a couple of questions around this thing, but let's get into the CFP issue that we have talked about a little bit on here and definitely has been talked about quite a lot not on here, and that's the bye weeks. Are the bye weeks a true disadvantage? Was it just this year? Is it something that is going to change going forward? There's a couple of different things to look out here, and there's a couple of different ways that we could possibly solve this issue. So obviously, as we all understand, all the bye teams lost. Oregon, Arizona State, Boise State, and Georgia all went down after getting their byes. Penn State went up 14-0 in the first quarter of the Fiesta Bowl. Texas opened up 17-3. Ohio State 34-0. It's kind of a little bit different. And then Notre Dame 13-3 in that first half. So it was pretty clear that all of these offenses struggled to get going, struggled to get their feet under them for different reasons depending on the game that you were looking at. But at the end of the day, does this really reward conference champions? Do these byes really give them the reward that they deserve, give them the leg up against some different teams that they absolutely do deserve for the remarkable seasons that they had? So that's the question that we have to kind of tackle here. And one of the big things that I think has kind of happened is people are assuming that this is going to happen every single year. I don't necessarily think that's the case, and there is a couple of reasons why this year feels to be a little bit different to me, at least in some respects. The biggest thing is two of these teams were double-digit underdogs. Now, Arizona State proved that they absolutely belong there. Boise State proved that they absolutely belong there. Now, Boise State didn't cover their spread, Arizona State did, but at the end of the day, when you look at these two teams, I don't think there were a lot of people picking Arizona State and Boise State. Now, both these teams made close games and it was very, very fun to watch these two teams play, but Arizona State entered as a 12.5 point underdog for a reason. Boise State, 11-point underdog for a reason, and when we come out of those games, I don't think anyone was sitting there saying, I cannot believe Penn State, I cannot believe Texas won. When we looked at the bracket initially, all of us said, if Texas wins that game against Clemson, if Penn State can handle SMU, they're a pretty good shot to get to that semifinal. So while both these teams really did prove, in a little way, me wrong in some respects, and definitely did prove a lot of people wrong and prove that they belong there, it wasn't all that surprising that Texas found a way to win that game. It wasn't all that surprising that in the second half, Penn State started to pull away from Boise State and make some really big plays down the stretch of that game. So while both these teams fought really, really hard and played incredible games and absolutely belonged there, and frankly, maybe even belonged in that bye spot, but at the end of the day, it's not all that surprising that they didn't come out on the winning side of things. Both these Penn State and Texas were massively favored in those games. Obviously, it took Texas a little bit longer to get that thing going, but at the end of the day, not overly surprising that these two teams lost. Definitely would have been a little bit more upsetting if they got blown out, and that would have been something more to talk about. But at the end of the day, both these teams were not necessarily expected to win, and they didn't win. So some of it is just kind of circumstantial of that respect, where you do have a former SEC and Big Ten championship participant. They're playing a team that they're probably going to be favored against in the majority of respects and probably going to have a number of advantages against. Obviously, Arizona State did a great job of fighting back in that game, but I don't think anyone woke up the next day saying they were shocked that Texas and Penn State won those two games. And then you got the other two, and they were slight underdogs with some extenuating factors in those games. And this is obviously something that we talked about when we were breaking down the Georgia-Notre Dame game. Gunnar Stockton is not why they lost that game. If Carson Beck plays that game, I don't think they win that game. So it's not necessarily to put it all on the quarterback and say if Carson Beck had played, it would have gone entirely differently. Does change the way that Notre Dame attacked that game. I do think they played a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage. I think they flew downhill a little bit more often than they probably would have if they were playing Carson Beck. So I do think it played a factor at the very least. I don't think it was the all end all be all of this game. I don't think it was the reason that Georgia lost this game. But that being said, it definitely was an extenuating factor going in. Definitely kind of changed the way that it was perceived as we were going into that game. A big reason why a lot of people picked Notre Dame to win that game. And then Ohio State is Ohio State. I mean, we all saw what we saw on last week, and if Ohio State's playing at that level of football, they're the best team in the country. They are going to beat Texas by double digits this upcoming week. They're going to beat the national champion, whoever that is, in a couple of weeks after that by double digits, and they will be the national champion. Period. End of story. So when you look at this Oregon team, it's very easy to look back and say, how could they let this one slip away, or look back and say they got really hurt by this format. And absolutely argue that you're correct. They definitely did get hurt by this auto buy system where Ohio State gets relegated down to the 8 spot instead of the 6 spot where they likely should have been playing Texas this past weekend. So a couple of different things that absolutely do have to be kind of tweaked here, but the reality is, I think when you look at these two games, or at least going into these two games, I picked Ohio State to win. I think a lot of other people did because we saw what Ohio State did against Tennessee. I don't think anyone thought it would be insane if they beat Oregon after that. And then regardless of the bye scenarios, one way or the other. And then for Georgia Notre Dame, without Carson Beck, it obviously changes the mental math of how this game is going to go down. A lot of people were picking Notre Dame for that reason. Now, that's not necessarily the reason that Georgia lost that game, but it is something to be said. I think the bye is not an advantage by any means. I do think the bye hurts you regardless of its, all things equal. I would rather play the game the week before than not play the game the week before. I fully agree with that. But I do think there were some extenuating circumstances in this year in particular that kind of hurt some teams that had those byes that maybe wouldn't hurt those teams quite as aggressively going forward. So I think there's an argument to be made that we need to get rid of bye weeks and we need to change the way that we go about it. But I think there's also an argument to be made that this year was just a little bit different. You had two conference champions in the Big 12 and in the Mountain West that found their way into those bye spots, and they played teams that were just a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger than they were. Now, Penn State showed that a little bit more than Texas did against Arizona State, and the gap was a little bit bigger in that game than it was against Texas-Arizona State. But at the end of the day, it definitely did have an effect on those two games. I don't think anyone was surprised that Texas and Penn State won those games. And then in these, Ohio State is an absolute juggernaut right now, and Georgia without their quarterback did change a little bit of that game. Don't think it changed the result, but absolutely changed the way that Notre Dame attacked that game. So overall, there's reasons for these bye struggles, and I don't necessarily know if they're going to follow over into 2025. They definitely could, and it's definitely something that we're going to have to explore over the next year, but there were certain things that were kind of just this year and might not be following it into next year. So definitely something to think about there. It'll be interesting to see, what we can do, and that's kind of what I want to explore here. A couple of solutions to fix this bye problem, whether that's getting rid of byes, ending auto byes, a couple of different things right here. And the first one is expanding to 16 teams. This is going to happen. I can almost promise you that this is going to happen. There are so many different things that happen across the sport that they're all in the name of money. Let's just be totally honest with ourselves. But I would aggressively argue that 8 teams is probably closer to the correct answer than it is the other teams. But at the end of the day, I do think it's one of those things where you're probably going to have 16 teams. I do think you could have auto buys, possibly auto home games, which is something we'll probably talk about in a little bit more detail down the road, because the reality is you probably do want to reward them for something, give them a home game possibly to give them a little bit more incentive to win that conference champion rather than possibly lose it on purpose to get a little bit better of a draw. So there's a lot of different things going into this. I do think 16 is probably where we're gonna land at the end of all this, and definitely will be interesting to see how we get there, if buys stick around for a little bit longer before we get there and everything like that. But then you got to talk about ending auto buys. This is something I do expect to happen. Now, the problem with that is the ACC, the Big 12, and all of the Group of 5 conferences have to sign off on that. And that's something that kind of the reason that I bring up that possible home field advantage no matter what if you win your conference. That probably is the way they're going to have to go to get the ACC, to get the Big 12 to sign off on this, and to get, teams like Boise State to be on board to do this. Is you're going to have to give them a little something. You're going to have to give them a little incentive to do it. Maybe giving him that home game is enough. Now, the funny part about this is if we didn't have auto buys this year, if that was not a thing going into this tournament, you would have gotten Penn State, Notre Dame, you would have gotten Texas, Ohio State in the quarterfinals. You would have gotten this past weekend, so it would have been very interesting, and obviously those auto buys changed the math, and they changed the way that this thing fully worked out. We would have gotten those semifinal games one thing earlier, and it would have been interesting to see how all of that kind of unfolded, but it's definitely something that we're going to have to talk about. All those conferences have to sign off on it, and it might be tough to get them to come to that table, but something we're going to definitely talk about going forward, and definitely something that will be pushed for very, very hard behind closed doors. And then this is something that I think a lot of people have kicked around. Some people have kicked around no home games at all, which I don't know if that would be quite the advantage that people want it to be. I think 2 rounds of home games could be an interesting idea. So hypothetically, you have a situation where instead of Ohio State and Oregon going down to play in Pasadena, they're going up to Eugene, Oregon, and you get to be behind your home crowd. Now, I think Ohio State was probably winning that game regardless, if I'm being totally honest with you, but the other one to think about, Gunnar Stockton making his first start in his UGA career in front of his home crowd instead of in New Orleans is an entire difference. So that definitely could have flipped that game just a little bit. Obviously could have helped that defense a little bit more, and definitely could have put that Notre Dame offense in some interesting waters early on. And then ASU, if they were playing that game at home against Texas, that crowd gets very involved very quickly. It's not split down the middle, and maybe they can keep that momentum going. Maybe they can win that game at the end of the day and possibly complete that comeback, and would have been really interesting. Definitely a better incentive for some of these teams to win their conference, and then they get that home game. Would change the math when you talk about bowl games. Where do you want to slot these bowl games? How do you want to utilize them? Would the Orange Bowl be willing to, at times, be outside of the playoff? That's kind of debate that will go back and forth. I'd be a little bit surprised if they were willing to do it, but at the end of the day, I do think it could be a solution, could be a way to reward these teams for getting that bye, and also keep that energy in those conference championships without, really tipping the scales one direction or the other. So I think there's a couple of different solutions out there. I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this. I don't love bye weeks. I do think the bye week, if everything else is equal, I would rather play the game than not play the game, if I'm being totally honest with you, but I do think there needs to be a nuanced conversation here, because I think some of the stuff that has happened this past week in accordance to these bye teams might not follow into 2025. It very well could, but I do think there needs to be some tweaking here and there with the bye weeks, and we just need to figure out a better way forward for that. Let me get to Anthony real quick here, but I just wanted to talk about this before we moved on. Yeah, give me 2 seconds here, Anthony. Apologies. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I've seen that stuff as well. I've seen Miami been kicking around for a couple of different guys in the portal, and it's all pointless, if I'm being totally honest with you. There's a million things that will start to come out, especially around that guy over there at Texas. There will be a million things that will come out about him. I tend to believe he's going to the draft. I really have not heard anything from people that I very much trust around that program to make me think anything different. Miami obviously is going to have to go out and get a quarterback, and they absolutely will. So we'll see what happens there. Definitely going to be really interesting to watch that unfold, but it's obviously something, it's going to happen every single year. People are going to have things to say. People are going to have quote-unquote sources that tell them that Quinn Ewers is going to Notre Dame, and then the next day he's going to Miami, and then the next day he's going to Oregon. At the end of the day, we will hear from him at some point when his season ends. We will hear from him one way or the other. Right now, I would very much lean towards him going to the draft. Can't necessarily say that with absolute confidence. So we'll get into that in time. Obviously, definitely something that we will talk about, and that Quinn Ewers news is something that I think a lot of people are waiting for. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about the SEC. The big question going around is the SEC dead? Are they officially done as the top program or top conference in the country, and how long could it take for them to get back on top? We'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.